Sometimes the most ordinary moments become the most extraordinary memories. Sometimes a loyal friend sees danger when nobody else can. Boone Walker was a mountain man who mostly kept to himself, living quietly in the Wyoming wilderness with his dog, Flint. They walked into the Dusty Lantern Diner that Tuesday morning, just looking for breakfast. But when Flint suddenly attacked a stranger's suitcase, everything changed. Inside that leather case were explosives and a timer, ready to destroy the peaceful town of Cedar Falls. The stranger tried to run, but Boone stopped him. A simple breakfast became the day that saved an entire community. But who was this stranger, and why did he want to hurt innocent people? How did a weathered mountain man and his faithful dog become heroes when the town needed them most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine branches like an old man's whiskers, soft and grey in the early light that filtered through the canopy above Boone Walker's cabin. He stood on his weathered porch, coffee mug steaming in his calloused hands, watching the sun paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and amber. This was his church, his sanctuary. This wild corner of Wyoming where the nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away, and the only sounds were wind through trees and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. Flint stretched beside him, a lean dog with the amber eyes of his coyote ancestry and the loyalty of a creature who'd found his place in the world. The dog's coat was a mixture of brown and gray, perfectly suited for blending into the rocky terrain they called home. His ears perked at every sound, always alert, always protective of the man who'd saved him from a trap 3 winters ago. Boone reached for his hand-carved walking stick, running his thumb over the tuck, mountain symbols he'd etched into the weathered oak during long winter evenings. Each mark told a story: the eagle for the first time he'd seen one soar over his ridge, the pine tree for the ancient giant that sheltered his cabin, the wolf for the pack that had accepted his presence in their territory. This stick had been his companion on countless walks through the high country, a piece of the wilderness he could carry with him. At 62, Boone had the kind of face that spoke of years spent outdoors, lined but strong, with grey hair that touched his collar and hands that knew the feel of axe handles and rifle stocks. His cabin was small but well built, constructed from logs he'd felled himself and chinked with mud and moss that kept out the harsh mountain winters. Solar panels provided modest electricity, a wood stove kept him warm, and a well he'd hand-dug supplied clear, cold water that tasted of snowmelt and stone. He'd built this life deliberately, piece by careful piece, after walking away from a world that had grown too loud, too fast, too demanding. The corporate job in Denver, the endless meetings, the politics and pressure, all of it felt like a cage compared to the freedom of these peaks. Here, his days followed natural rhythms. He rose with the sun, worked with his hands, and slept when darkness fell across the valley. The town of Cedar Falls lay 23 miles down a winding mountain road, a journey Boone made once each month for supplies he couldn't grow, hunt, or make himself. It was a small community of maybe 800 souls, the kind of place where folks still waved at strangers, and the local diner served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Most residents had lived there all their lives, their families going back generations to when cattle ranchers and railroad workers first settled the valley. Boone knew the townspeople in the way of someone who observes but doesn't quite belong. There was Martha Henley, who ran the general store with the efficiency of a drill sergeant and the heart of a grandmother. She always had a kind word and fresh-baked cookies cooling on the counter. Tom Bradley owned the gas station and could fix anything with an engine, his hands permanently stained with grease, and his stories about classic cars legendary among the locals. At the Dusty Lantern Diner, Vera May served the best apple pie in 3 counties, while her husband Earl manned the grill with the precision of a man who'd cooked 10,000 breakfasts. Their daughter Sarah waited tables with a smile that could brighten the cloudiest day, always remembering how customers liked their coffee and never forgetting to ask about family. Sheriff Pete Morrison had been keeping the peace in Cedar Falls for 15 years, a steady man with grey at his temples and a reputation for fairness that extended far beyond the county line. His deputy, young Jake Collins, looked up to him like a son to a father, eager to learn the subtle art of maintaining order in a place where most problems could be solved with conversation and common sense. These were good people living good lives in a place where children still rode bicycles without fear and neighbors helped neighbors through hard times. It was the kind of community that reminded Boone why he'd chosen this mountain, close enough to civilization to remember its virtues, far enough away to avoid its complications. His monthly trips to town followed a predictable pattern. First stop, Bradley's station to fuel his old Ford pickup, a 1987 model that ran like new because Boone maintained it with the same care he gave everything else. Then Martha's store for flour, sugar, coffee, and whatever else his list demanded. Sometimes the hardware store if he needed nails or wire. Always the diner for a hot meal he didn't have to cook himself. The townspeople treated him with polite respect, the kind reserved for someone who was decent but distant. They called him Mr. Walker, nodded, when they passed him on the street, but rarely engaged in lengthy conversation. He preferred it that way. Small talk felt awkward after years of silence, and he'd grown protective of his solitude the way some men guard their wallets. Flint was different in town, more alert, more watchful. The dog seemed to understand that this was not their territory, that here they were visitors in a world of strangers. He stayed close to Boone's side, amber eyes scanning faces and shadows with the caution of a creature who'd learned to read danger in the wild. The mountains had taught Boone patience, observation, the value of listening more than speaking. He'd learned to read weather in cloud formations, to track animals by the subtlest signs, to find his way through trackless wilderness by the position of stars. These skills had made him self-sufficient in ways that few men his age could claim. He could hunt, fish, trap, garden, preserve food for winter, repair anything that broke, and build whatever he needed from materials the forest provided. Winter was his favorite season, when snow locked the high country in silence so complete it felt sacred. He'd spend those months reading by lamplight, carving wood, maintaining his equipment, and planning for spring. The isolation never bothered him. He'd grown tired of human drama long before he'd climbed his mountain, weary of the endless complications that seemed to follow people like shadows. But sometimes, sitting by his fire on cold nights with Flint sleeping at his feet, Boone wondered if he'd become too comfortable in his solitude. The dog was good company, loyal and understanding, but there were conversations a man could only have with his own kind. There were stories worth telling and wisdom worth sharing, connections that even the most self-sufficient hermit occasionally craved. He pushed such thoughts away as he finished his coffee and prepared for the day ahead. This was Tuesday, supply day, which meant the long drive to Cedar Falls and back before evening. The truck started on the first try, as always, and Flint took his usual position on the passenger seat, nose pressed to the window as they descended the mountain road. The aspen trees were turning gold, their leaves shimmering in the morning breeze like coins in sunlight. Soon, the first snow would dust the peaks, and winter would begin its slow advance down the mountainsides. Boone had already split his firewood, stocked his pantry, and prepared for the months of isolation ahead. But first, this monthly journey to the world below, this brief reminder of the life he'd chosen to leave behind. The road wound through pine forests and granite outcroppings, past hidden meadows where elk grazed in the early morning light. It was a beautiful drive, one that never failed to remind Boone why he'd fallen in love with this country. The mountains were honest in their demands, generous in their gifts, and eternal in their wisdom. They'd been here long, before human ambition, and would remain long after human folly had run its course. As the truck rounded the final curve and Cedar Falls came into view, Boone felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied his return to civilization. The buildings, the streets, the bustle of human activity, it all felt overwhelming after weeks of mountain silence. But he'd made this journey for years now, and he'd make it again. Some things a man simply had to endure. The brass bell above the dusty lantern diner door chimed as Boone pushed inside, the familiar scent of bacon grease and fresh coffee greeting him like an old friend. The morning rush had thinned to a handful of regulars. Charlie Morrison reading his newspaper at the corner booth, old Pete Henderson nursing his third cup of coffee while solving the world's problems with whoever would listen, and a stranger in a dark coat sitting alone near the back window. Vera May looked up from the coffee pot with her usual warm smile. "Morning, Boone. The usual spot?" He nodded toward his customary table by the front window, where he could keep an eye on his truck, and Flint could watch the street from the passenger seat. The dog had his nose pressed against the glass, amber eyes alert as always. Something about the way Flint's ears stood at attention made Boone glance around the diner more carefully than usual. The stranger in the back caught his attention, a thin man with nervous hands and eyes that wouldn't stay still. He wore a wool coat despite the mild autumn weather, and a worn leather suitcase sat tucked under his chair like a faithful dog. The case looked expensive once, but years of travel had scuffed its corners and faded its rich brown color to something closer to rust. "Coffee's fresh," Sarah said, appearing at his table with a steaming mug and that bright smile that reminded everyone why her parents were so proud. "Dad's got your usual ready-to-go 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast and bacon. Crispy enough to break your teeth." "Much obliged," Boone said, accepting the coffee with grateful hands. The first sip was perfect, strong and hot, exactly what a man needed after the winding drive down from the mountains. Outside, Flint had begun pacing across the truck's bench seat, a behavior Boone had never seen before. The dog's tail was rigid, his hackles raised just enough to be visible through the window. Something had him agitated, something more than the usual sounds and smells of town. The stranger in the back booth shifted in his seat, and Boone noticed how his eyes kept darting toward the door, then to his watch, then back to the door. His breakfast sat untouched, eggs growing cold, while he sipped coffee with hands that trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. Earl brought out Boone's breakfast himself, a rare occurrence that usually meant the cook wanted to chat about hunting or fishing. But today the older man seemed distracted, glancing toward the stranger's table with the kind of look that suggested something wasn't right. "Don't recognize him," Earl said quietly, setting down the plate. "Been sitting there near an hour, ordered breakfast, but ain't touched it. Keeps checking that old suitcase like it might run off." Boone cut into his eggs, letting the yellow yolks spread across the plate while he considered Earl's words. In a town the size of Cedar Falls, strangers stood out like sore thumbs, especially ones who acted nervous about their luggage. Through the window, Flint had begun scratching at the glass, whimpering in a way that made Boone's chest tighten. The dog's behavior was becoming more agitated by the minute, and 30 years of wilderness living had taught Boone to trust animal instincts over human assumptions. The stranger suddenly stood, reaching for his suitcase with movements too quick and jerky for casual departure. As he bent to retrieve the case, its weight seemed to surprise him, and he had to use both hands to lift it from under the table. That's when Flint lost control. The dog's bark erupted through the diner's front window like a gunshot, sharp and urgent, and filled with a fury that made every head turn. Boone was already moving toward the door when Flint began throwing himself against the glass, claws scrabbling for purchase as he tried to get inside. "What in the Sam Hill?" Pete Henderson started to say, but his words were cut off by the sound of splintering wood. The diner's back door had burst open, and Flint came through it like a bolt of lightning, having somehow escaped the truck and circled around the building. The dog's lips were pulled back in a snarl that showed every one of his sharp teeth, and his amber eyes were locked on the stranger's leather suitcase with laser focus. "Get that animal away from me!" the stranger shouted, clutching the case against his chest like a shield. But Flint was beyond commands, beyond reason, beyond anything except the instinct, that told him this case represented mortal danger. He launched himself across the diner, scattering chairs and sending Sarah stumbling backward with a startled cry. The stranger tried to run, but Flint's jaws clamped down on the suitcase's handle just as the man reached the front door. The case was yanked from his grasp, and both dog and luggage went tumbling across the checkered linoleum in a confusion of growls and snapping leather. "Flint!" Boone commanded, but the dog paid no attention. With a sound like breaking bones, the suitcase's old brass latch gave way. The case fell open, spilling its contents across the floor in a scatter that turned the entire diner to stone. Dynamite sticks lay among the scattered newspapers and coffee cups like deadly fingers. Wires snaked between them, leading to a digital device that blinked red numbers in countdown fashion. The timer read 11:47, then 11:46, then 11:45, each second ticking away like a heartbeat racing towards silence. The silence in the diner was complete except for the quiet electronic beeping of the device. Forks hung suspended halfway to mouths, coffee cups froze at lips. Even Flint had gone still, his job apparently done, amber eyes now watching the humans with the patience of a creature who delivered his warning. The stranger bolted for the door, but Boone was faster than anyone would have expected from a man his age. Years of mountain living had kept him lean and strong, and 30 years of walking rocky terrain had given him sure feet and quick reflexes. He caught the man 3 steps from the exit, one arm wrapping around his throat, while the other pinned his arms against his sides. The stranger struggled, but mountain work had given Boone the kind of strength that comes from splitting wood and hauling water and building shelter with hand tools. "Don't move," Boone said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced down bears and lived through blizzards. "Nobody move." Sheriff Morrison appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, his hand already on his service weapon. His eyes took in the scene, the scattered explosives, the blinking timer, the stranger in Boone's grip, and his face went pale beneath his tan. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed. The timer continued its relentless countdown, 11:15, 11:14, 11:13. "Pete," Boone said calmly, "you need to call the state boys. Tell them we've got a bomb." Through it all, Flint sat quietly beside the ruined suitcase, tongue lolling out in satisfaction. His tail gave a single wag, as if to say the job was done, and he was ready for whatever came next. The stranger had gone limp in Boone's arms. All fight drained out of him now that his plan had crumbled to pieces on a diner floor. Whatever he'd intended to accomplish with those explosives, a mountain man's dog had just saved an entire town from finding out. The state bomb squad arrived from Cheyenne within 2 hours. Their van, equipped with robots and protective gear that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Agent Lisa Caldwell, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and the calm demeanor of someone who diffused more bombs than she cared to count, took charge of the scene with quiet efficiency. The dusty lantern had been evacuated and cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered in the mountain breeze like warning flags. The entire block had been cleared, residents and business owners standing behind barriers, while specialists in heavy suits examined the device that Flint had uncovered. Boone sat in Sheriff Morrison's office, the stranger handcuffed to a chair across from him, while Flint dozed at his feet. The dog seemed remarkably untroubled by the morning's events, as if discovering bombs was just another day's work for a creature who'd learned to trust his instincts above all else. The stranger had given his name as David Kellner, though Agent Caldwell had already confirmed through fingerprints that he was actually Marcus Webb, a former mining engineer with ties to several radical environmental groups. His hands shook as he sipped the coffee Sarah had brought over before the evacuation, and his eyes never left the small wooden cross that hung from a chain around his neck. "The timer was set for 11:15 this morning," Agent Caldwell explained to the assembled group. "That's exactly when the school bus would have been passing the diner on its way to pick up the Henderson children. The explosion would have killed everyone in that building and likely damaged the hardware store next door." Boone's jaw tightened, as the implications sank in. The Henderson family had been part of Cedar Falls for 3 generations. Old Pete's grandchildren rode that bus every morning, their bright faces pressed against the windows as they waved at familiar faces on Main Street. But why? Sheriff Morrison asked, his voice heavy with the burden of protecting people he'd known all his life. What did this town ever do to deserve something like this? Webb looked up from his coffee, his face pale but defiant. "The mine," he said quietly, "the copper mine up in Eagle Valley. It's poisoning the groundwater, killing everything for miles downstream. I tried the legal channels, tried petitions and protests and environmental impact studies. Nobody listened." "So you decided to murder innocent people?" Boone asked, his voice carrying the edge of a man who'd spent too many years watching civilization's failures from a safe distance. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Webb protested. "The timer was supposed to go off at midnight when the diner was empty. Just enough damage to get attention, to make people listen to what's happening to this land." Agent Caldwell consulted her notes. The timer mechanism was faulty. Several components had corroded, causing it to run fast. Instead of detonating at midnight tomorrow, it would have exploded this morning during the breakfast rush. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief for a tragedy that had been measured in minutes rather than hours. If not for Flint's inexplicable ability to sense danger, the morning would have ended with sirens and body bags instead of coffee and conversation. "How did your dog know?" Webb asked, staring at Flint with something approaching awe. "Animals can't smell explosives unless they're specially trained." Boone reached down to scratch behind Flint's ears, feeling the familiar texture of fur that had dried after countless mountain streams and warmed beside countless campfires. "He's got coyote in his blood," he said simply. "Coyotes can sense things that domestic animals miss. Storms coming, earthquakes building, danger that doesn't have a name yet." Through the office window, Boone could see the townspeople gathered in small groups behind the police barriers. Martha Henley had her arm around Vera May, whose tears had finally stopped, but whose hands still trembled when she thought about how close they'd come to losing everything. Tom Bradley was pacing back and forth, his mechanic's hands clenched into fists as he struggled with the knowledge that someone had tried to destroy his home. These were people who'd never hurt anyone, who'd built their lives on the simple premise that hard work and kindness were enough to make a decent existence. The idea that someone would target them for the crimes of a distant mining company seemed as foreign as visitors from another planet. Sheriff Morrison's radio crackled with updates from his deputy, who was helping coordinate the scene. "Pete, the bomb squad says we're all clear. Device has been disarmed and removed. They want to interview anyone who had contact with the suspect." Webb was staying at the Pineview Motel, Agent Caldwell added, consulting her phone. "My team is searching his room now. We'll need statements from everyone who saw him in town, particularly anyone who might have noticed suspicious behavior." Boone thought back over the morning, remembering how Webb had sat alone in the back booth, how his hands had shaken, how he'd kept checking his watch, as if waiting for something to happen. The signs had been there for anyone observant enough to notice them, but in a small town where strangers were rare but not unheard of, unusual behavior was easily explained away. "He's been here 3 days, Sheriff Morrison said, reading from his notes. "Paid cash for the motel room, told Betty Carson he was a freelance writer researching small-town life for a magazine article. She thought he was a little odd, but writers are supposed to be odd." The wooden cross around Webb's neck caught the afternoon light streaming through the office window. It was hand-carved, probably made by someone who'd learned woodworking the old way, with patience and attention to detail. The irony wasn't lost on Boone. A man wearing a symbol of peace and forgiveness had come within minutes of committing mass murder. "The mine he mentioned," Agent Caldwell said to Sheriff Morrison. "Eagle Valley Copper. What can you tell me about it?" Morrison rubbed his forehead with the gesture of a man carrying too much responsibility. "Started operations about 5 years ago. Big company out of Denver, promised jobs and tax revenue for the county. There've been some complaints from environmental groups, but nothing that seemed serious enough for this kind of response. Serious enough for him, Boone observed quietly. Webb looked up with eyes that held equal parts conviction and regret. You don't understand what they're doing up there. The chemicals they're using, the waste they're dumping into Eagle Creek. In 10 years, this whole valley will be a dead zone. The fish are already dying, and the elk won't drink from the stream anymore. So you appointed yourself judge and jury, Agent Caldwell said with the tone of someone who'd heard too many justifications for inexcusable acts. Someone had to do something, Webb replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Outside, the townspeople were beginning to drift back to their businesses and homes, the immediate crisis over, but the questions still hanging in the mountain air like morning mist. A stranger had come to their peaceful valley carrying death in a leather suitcase, and only the instincts of a half-wild dog had prevented unspeakable tragedy. By late afternoon, the federal agents had finished their preliminary investigation and taken Webb into custody. The bomb components had been catalogued and removed, the diner cleared for reopening, and the yellow tape rolled up like party streamers after a celebration that no one wanted to remember. But Cedar Falls didn't feel the same. Boone sat at his usual table in the dusty lantern, watching Vera May wipe down surfaces that were already clean. Her movements were mechanical, repetitive, as if the familiar motions could somehow restore the sense of safety that had been shattered along with Webb's suitcase latch. Earl stood behind the grill, staring at the spot where the explosives had scattered across his floor like deadly confetti. The diner's old cash register sat open on the counter, its brass keys gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Vera May had been counting the day's receipts when the bomb squad arrived, and the register had remained untouched throughout the evacuation. A mundane artifact of interrupted routine that now seemed to mock the morning's terror. "Can't get my head around it," Earl said, for the third time since reopening. "Man sits right there in my place, drinking my coffee, planning to blow us all to kingdom come." Sarah moved between tables with less spring in her step, her usual bright smile replaced by a thoughtful expression that made her look older than her 23 years. She'd insisted on staying to help her parents, even though Sheriff Morrison had suggested she might want to take the rest of the day off. "What bothers me most," she said, refilling Boone's coffee cup, "is how normal he seemed. Just another traveling businessman. Maybe a little nervous about a presentation or something. You don't expect evil to look so ordinary." Boone studied the faces around him, people he'd observed for years, but never really known. Today's events had stripped away the polite distance he'd maintained, revealing the deeper connections that bound these people together like family. Their vulnerability in the face of unexpected danger had awakened something in him that he'd thought was permanently buried. Through the window, he could see townspeople gathering in small groups along Main Street, their conversations animated with the kind of energy that comes from surviving something terrible. Children who'd been kept home from school after the bomb threat were now playing on the sidewalk under their parents' watchful eyes, their resilience. A reminder that life insists on continuing even after brushes with mortality. Tom Bradley appeared in the diner's doorway, his mechanic's coveralls stained with grease and his face bearing the expression of a man wrestling with difficult thoughts. He'd been checking and rechecking the gas pumps at his station, as if ensuring their mechanical integrity could somehow restore order to a world that suddenly felt unpredictable. "Boone," he said, approaching the table with the hesitation of someone crossing unfamiliar territory. "Mind if I sit?" It was the first time in 5 years that any of the locals had initiated a conversation beyond pleasantries about weather and road conditions. Boone gestured to the empty chair, curious about what had prompted this breach of their mutual respect for privacy. Tom settled his bulk into the chair and accepted the coffee Sarah offered. "Been thinking about what happened this morning," he began, his hands wrapped around the mug like an anchor. "About how your dog knew something was wrong when the rest of us were blind as bats." "Animals see things differently," Boone replied. "They don't make assumptions about safety the way people do." "That's what I'm getting at," Tom said. leaning forward with the intensity of someone working through a problem that wouldn't let go. We've been assuming this is a safe place, that nothing bad could happen here because nothing bad ever has. But maybe we've been fooling ourselves. The conversation drew Vera May over from the counter, her dish towel twisted in nervous hands. "Tom's right," she said quietly. "I keep thinking about how that timer was ticking away while we served breakfast and chatted about the weather. Death was sitting right there in our dining room, and we never suspected a thing." Earl emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. 27 years I've been cooking in this place," he said. "Served thousands of meals to thousands of people. Never once occurred to me that someone might walk through that door planning murder." "But they did," Sarah added, her voice carrying a note of wonder that wasn't entirely pleasant. "And if Boone hadn't been here, if his dog hadn't sensed the danger—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. The randomness of their salvation was almost as disturbing as the proximity of their destruction. A mountain man's monthly supply run and a dog's inexplicable instincts had been all that stood between Cedar Falls and catastrophe. "Question is," Tom said, "what do we do now? How do we go back to normal when normal almost got us killed?" The question revealed the deeper wound that Webb's attack had inflicted. The bomb itself had been defused and removed, but the explosive idea that their peaceful valley could be targeted by forces beyond their understanding would take much longer to neutralize. The innocence that had protected them from fear was gone, blown away, as surely as if the device had actually detonated. "Maybe normal wasn't as safe as we thought," Boone observed, speaking the truth that everyone was dancing around. "Maybe we need to pay more attention to the world outside our valley." Vera May sat down at the table, abandoning pretense that she needed to keep working. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the old days, when folks had to watch out for raiders and claim jumpers. She said people looked after each other because they knew danger could come from anywhere, anytime. Different kind of danger now," Earl said, joining the impromptu gathering. "Can't shoot a bomb with a rifle or drive off environmental terrorists with a shotgun." The brass cash register caught the late afternoon light, its open drawer a reminder of interrupted normalcy. But the conversation around Boone's table suggested something new was beginning to emerge from the ruins of their shattered assumptions, a recognition that safety was something they would have to create rather than simply assume. "Maybe that's not all bad," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Maybe we've been living too separate, too trusting that nothing could touch us here." Boone felt something shifting in his chest, a loosening of the barriers he'd built around his solitary life. These people were inviting him into their circle, seeking his wisdom and perspective in ways they never had before. The morning's crisis had revealed not just their vulnerability, but also their strength and their capacity for connection when it mattered most. 3 days after the bombing attempt, Boone found himself driving down the mountain road to Cedar Falls for the second time in 1 week, something that hadn't happened in the 5 years since he'd established his monthly routine. The reason sat beside him in the truck's cab, a detailed topographical map of Eagle Valley that he'd spent 2 nights studying by lamplight, marking water sources, access roads, and the location of the copper mine that had driven Webb to attempted murder. The map was hand-drawn on, heavy parchment, created by his own careful measurements during hunting trips through the high country. Every contour line represented hours of walking and observation, every stream and ridge noted with the precision of a man who understood that accurate maps could mean the difference between life and death in wilderness terrain. Red ink marked the mine's boundaries, blue traced Eagle Creek's path through the valley, and green indicated the areas where Boone had noticed changes in wildlife behavior over the past 2 years. Sheriff Morrison had called that morning with a request that surprised them both. The FBI wanted to interview Boone about the area around the mine, seeking his perspective as someone who knew the high country better than anyone else in the region. Agent Caldwell had learned about his reputation from questioning townspeople, discovering that the quiet mountain man was regarded as the valley's unofficial expert on everything above the tree line. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the sheriff's office, but Boone had arrived early to spend time observing the town's mood in the aftermath of Webb's arrest. The rhythm of daily life was slowly returning to Cedar Falls, but subtle changes marked the passing of their collective innocence. Conversations were quieter, glances more watchful, and the easy trust that had characterized small-town interaction was tempered by new awareness of the world's potential for sudden violence. At the hardware store, old Ben Crawford was installing new security cameras above the entrance. The Pine View Motel had placed a sign requiring guests to show identification and provide emergency contact information. Even the post office had added a bulletin board asking residents to report suspicious activities or unfamiliar vehicles in the area. Boone parked outside the sheriff's office and studied his hand-drawn map one final time. The red lines marking the mine's perimeter had grown larger over the past 18 months, expanding into areas that had once been pristine wilderness. The operation was bigger than most residents realized, carving roads and clearings deep into country that few people ever visited. Agent Caldwell was waiting in Morrison's office, her laptop open and several aerial photographs spread across the desk. She looked up when Boone entered, her gray eyes sharp with the intelligence that had made her one of the Bureau's leading experts on environmental terrorism. "Mr. Walker," she said, standing to shake his hand. "Thank you for coming in. I understand you know the Eagle Valley area better than anyone." Boone unfolded his map on the desk beside her photographs. "Been hunting and hiking up there for most of 20 years, he said simply. Watched it change since the mining started. The contrast between his hand-drawn chart and the Bureau's satellite imagery was striking. Where the government photos showed broad areas of terrain in clinical detail, Boone's map revealed the intimate knowledge of someone who had walked every trail and crossed every stream. His notations included seasonal water levels, wildlife migration patterns, and the subtle environmental changes that only long observation could detect. Webb mentioned contamination in Eagle Creek, Agent Caldwell said, pointing to the blue line that wound through Boone's map. "Have you noticed anything unusual in your travels?" Boone traced the creek's path with his finger, remembering morning walks along its banks in years past. "Fish kills started about 18 months ago," he said. "Not dramatic, just fewer trout in pools where they used to be thick as fleas. Elk stopped drinking from the upper reaches around the same time." Sheriff Morrison leaned forward with interest. "You never mentioned that before." "Wasn't asked," Boone replied. "Besides, animals change their habits for lots of reasons. Could have been drought, predator pressure, natural cycles. But when you add it to Webb's claims about chemical contamination, it starts to paint a picture." Agent Caldwell finished. She opened her laptop and pulled up a series of environmental reports. "The mine is required to file quarterly water quality assessments with the state. All of them show readings well within acceptable limits." Boone studied the data with the skepticism of someone who'd learned to trust direct observation over official documents. "Where do they take their samples?" "Here," she said, pointing to a location on the satellite photo. "About 2 miles downstream from the processing facility." Boone's weathered finger found the same spot on his hand-drawn map. "That's below, where Willow Creek feeds into Eagle Creek. Willow runs clear and cold year-round, comes off snowmelt from the high peaks. Would dilute anything coming from upstream." The insight was simple but significant. If the mine was releasing contaminants into Eagle Creek, testing the water after it had been diluted by a major tributary would naturally produce readings that appeared normal. Whether this was deliberate deception or bureaucratic oversight, the result was the same: potential environmental damage was being masked by inadequate monitoring. "Webb might have been right about the contamination," Agent Caldwell said quietly. "That doesn't excuse attempted mass murder, but it suggests his concerns weren't entirely delusional." Morrison rubbed his forehead with the gesture that was becoming habitual since the bombing attempt. "So we've got a legitimate environmental problem that drove a man to terrorism, and a mining company that may be hiding evidence of contamination. Great. Through the office window, Boone could see Main Street returning to its normal mid-morning pace. Martha Henley was arranging produce outside the grocery store, while her grandson helped carry boxes. The scene was peaceful and familiar, but knowledge of the larger forces at work in Eagle Valley added an ominous undercurrent to the bucolic setting. "There's something else," Boone said, returning his attention to the map. "Webb couldn't have planned this operation alone. The bombing, I mean. He might have been the one carrying the device, but someone else had to provide technical expertise." Agent Caldwell's eyes sharpened. "What makes you say that?" "His hands," Boone replied, remembering details from their confrontation in the diner. "Clean, soft, like he worked in an office. But assembling explosive devices requires mechanical skill, comfort with tools and chemicals. He didn't strike me as someone who knew his way around a workshop." The observation opened new questions about Webb's connections and the possibility that his attack was part of a larger environmental extremist network. If other members of his group remained at large, Cedar Falls might still be in danger. That evening, Boone sat in his cabin with Flint stretched out beside the fireplace, studying a collection of newspaper clippings that Agent Caldwell had given him before he left town. The articles, dating back 3 years, documented a pattern of environmental activism that had gradually escalated from peaceful protests to property damage to the attempted bombing in Cedar Falls. The headlines told a story of increasing frustration. Environmental group challenges mine permits, protesters chain themselves to mining equipment, eco-warriors sabotage company vehicles. Webb's name appeared in several of the permits, earlier articles as a spokesperson for the Sierra Alliance, a group that claimed corporate mining was destroying the American West one mountain at a time. Boone's reading glasses, a recent concession to age that he kept hidden from the townspeople, perched on his nose as he examined a photograph from 18 months ago. Webb stood with 4 other activists beside Eagle Creek, holding a dead trout while pointing accusingly at the mine's processing facility in the background. The image captured the moment when legitimate environmental concern had begun its transformation into something darker and more desperate. The reading glasses were an artifact of approaching mortality that Boone found difficult to accept. For 62 years, his vision had been sharp enough to spot elk at a mile and track deer through thick timber. The gradual blurring that made small print difficult felt like a betrayal by his own body, a reminder that even mountain-hardened men eventually succumb to time's relentless advance. Flint raised his head as a truck engine rumbled up the mountain road, an unusual sound this late in the evening. Visitors were rare at any time, but after dark, they were virtually unheard of. Boone folded the newspaper clippings and moved to the window, watching headlights wind through the pine trees toward his clearing. Sheriff Morrison's patrol car pulled into the yard, followed by a second vehicle that Boone didn't recognize, a dark sedan with government plates and windows tinted black. As midnight, Agent Caldwell emerged from the passenger side of the sheriff's car, while 2 men in suits climbed out of the sedan, their movements suggesting the kind of training that came from federal law enforcement academies. "Evening, Boone," Morrison called out as they approached the porch. "Sorry to bother you so late, but we've got developments that couldn't wait until morning." Boone invited them inside, noting how Flint remained alert but calm in the presence of the visitors. The dog's acceptance suggested these people posed no immediate threat, though his amber eyes continued to track their movements with the wariness of a creature that had learned to read human intentions. Agent Caldwell got straight to business. "We arrested 2 more members of Webb's group this afternoon in Denver, a woman named Jennifer Hayes and a man called Thomas Garrett. Hayes is a chemist with expertise in explosives, and Garrett is a former Army demolitions expert who was dishonorably discharged 5 years ago." The news confirmed Boone's suspicion that Webb hadn't acted alone, but it also raised disturbing questions about the scope of their operations. Professional bomb-making skills suggested capabilities that went far beyond the crude device that Flint had uncovered in the diner. They had materials for at least 6 more bombs, one of the federal agents added, along with detailed plans for attacks on mining operations throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. Cedar Falls was apparently just the beginning. Boone felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain evening. The idea that his peaceful valley had been selected as the opening move in a larger campaign of environmental terrorism was almost impossible to process. The randomness of it, the fact that innocent people had been targeted simply because they lived near a mining operation, spoke to a kind of fanaticism that he'd thought belonged to distant conflicts in foreign countries. "There's more, Agent," Caldwell continued. During questioning, Hayes revealed that they've been monitoring your movements for weeks. They know about your monthly trips to town, your routines, even the location of this cabin. The violation of his privacy was almost as disturbing as the threat itself. For 5 years, Boone had lived in the comforting illusion that his mountain sanctuary was unknown to the outside world. The discovery that strangers had been watching him, cataloging his habits, treating him as a potential obstacle to their plans, shattered the sense of security that had made his solitary life possible. "Why would they be watching me?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "You're the only person in the area with extensive knowledge of the high country," Sheriff Morrison explained. "If they wanted to target the mine directly, or establish a base camp for extended operations, they'd need to avoid someone who might spot their activities." Agent Caldwell opened a folder, spread several photographs across Boone's kitchen table. The images showed his cabin from various angles, clearly taken with telephoto lenses from concealed positions in the surrounding forest. There were pictures of him splitting wood, working in his garden, even sitting on his porch with his morning coffee. "These were found in Hayes's apartment," she said quietly, "along with detailed notes about your daily routines and movement patterns." The sense of violation was complete. Every moment of privacy, every ritual of solitary life that had given meaning to his existence, had been observed and recorded by people who saw him as nothing more than a potential problem to be solved. The mountain sanctuary that had protected him from civilization's complications had been penetrated by the very forces he'd sought to escape. Flint moved closer to Boone's chair, as if sensing his distress. The dog's warm presence was comforting, a reminder that loyalty and trust still existed in a world that seemed increasingly defined by surveillance and suspicion. "What do you need from me?" Boone asked, pushing aside his personal feelings to focus on the larger threat. "We want to place you and the town under protective surveillance," Agent Caldwell replied. "At least until we're certain we've rounded up all members of this cell." The idea of federal agents watching his every move was almost as disturbing as the knowledge that terrorists had been doing the same thing. But the alternative, remaining vulnerable to attack while environmental extremists plotted violence, was clearly unacceptable. The simple mountain life he'd built was colliding with a complex world that refused to leave him alone. The revelation came at dawn, delivered by Agent Caldwell's urgent phone call that shattered the mountain silence like a gunshot. Boone had been awake for an hour, standing on his porch with coffee steaming in the cold air, watching the sun paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. The beauty of the morning felt almost mocking now, knowing that danger lurked behind every shadow and strangers watched his every movement from concealed positions in the forest. "Mr. Walker," Caldwell's voice crackled through the static. "We need you in town immediately. There's been a development that changes everything." The drive down the mountain road felt different now, laden with the knowledge that his truck might be followed, his movements tracked, his destination anticipated by people who meant him harm. Flint sensed his tension, sitting more alertly in the passenger seat, amber eyes scanning the tree line for threats that might emerge without warning. At the sheriff's office, Boone found chaos barely contained within professional facades. Agent Caldwell looked haggard, as if she hadn't slept in 24 hours. Sheriff Morrison paced behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, while he coordinated with state authorities. 2 additional federal agents worked at laptops, their screens filled with data that seemed to multiply faster than anyone could process it. "We got it wrong," Caldwell said, without preamble as soon as Boone entered the office. The environmental terrorism angle, Webb's group, everything. It was all misdirection, designed to hide the real plot. She gestured to a conference table covered with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be financial records. Webb wasn't an environmental extremist trying to stop the mine. He was being paid by the mining company to create a terrorist incident that would justify increased security measures and federal protection for their operations. The words hit Boone like a physical blow. Everything they'd believed about Webb's motivations, about the threat to Cedar Falls, about the environmental conspiracy, all of it had been carefully orchestrated deception. The leather journal lying open on the conference table contained Webb's real plans, written in his own hand, documenting payments from Eagle Valley Copper and detailed instructions for creating a false flag operation. The journal was bound in cracked brown leather, its pages filled with Webb's meticulous handwriting that chronicled 18 months of planning and preparation. Bank deposit records were paper-clipped to pages describing meetings with mining company executives. Photographs of potential targets were annotated with notes about collateral damage and public relations impact. It was a roadmap to manufactured terrorism designed to create the very fear it pretended to oppose. The bomb in the diner wasn't meant to kill anyone, Agent Caldwell explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. It was designed to malfunction, to be discovered before detonation. The whole incident was supposed to generate sympathy for the mining company and justify a massive increase in their security budget. Sheriff Morrison ended his phone call and joined them at the table. "Federal contracts," he said grimly. "Mining. Companies with terrorism threats against their operations qualify for government security assistance." Webb's fake attack would have brought in millions of dollars in federal protection money. Boone studied the journal entries, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he tried to process the scope of the deception. Webb's careful handwriting documented a cynical calculation of human psychology, detailing how manufactured fear could be converted into political support and financial profit. The environmental concerns were real. Boone's own observations confirmed contamination in Eagle Creek, but they had been weaponized by the very corporation causing the damage. "The dead fish, the water contamination," Boone said slowly. "That's all real. But instead of addressing the problem, the mining company decided to use it as cover for a false flag operation." "Exactly," Caldwell confirmed. "They recruited environmental activists like Webb, fed them information about the contamination, then offered them money to stage attacks that would discredit the entire environmental movement while generating public support for increased mining security. The elegant cruelty of the plan was breathtaking in its scope. By creating fake environmental terrorism, Eagle Valley Copper could simultaneously neutralize legitimate environmental opposition and secure government funding for protecting operations that should have been shut down for cleanup. Webb and his associates weren't environmental heroes or terrorists. They were paid actors in a corporate drama designed to manipulate public opinion. "But something went wrong," Morrison continued. "The timer mechanism wasn't supposed to malfunction. The bomb was meant to be discovered with hours to spare, creating drama without danger. Instead, it nearly exploded during the breakfast rush." Flint's unexpected intervention had prevented not just a massacre, but the successful completion of a false flag operation that would have changed the political landscape of environmental regulation throughout the region. A dog's instincts had unraveled a conspiracy that reached from a small-town diner to corporate boardrooms in Denver. "Where does this leave us?" Boone asked, feeling the ground shift beneath assumptions he'd thought were solid. Agent Caldwell closed the leather journal with a gesture that seemed final. 3 mining company executives have been arrested in Denver. Webb and his associates are cooperating fully now that they understand they were being set up to take the fall for corporate conspiracy. The mine's operations have been suspended pending environmental review. Through the office window, Boone could see Cedar Falls beginning another day. residents moving through familiar routines without understanding how close they'd come to being pawns in someone else's game. The simplicity of their lives, the very quality that made the town worth protecting, had also made it vulnerable to manipulation by forces too complex for honest people to easily recognize. The environmental damage is real, Caldwell added. Your observations about wildlife behavior and water contamination were accurate, but instead of addressing the problem through legal channels, corporate executives decided it was cheaper to manufacture terrorism and blame environmentalists. Boone removed his reading glasses and folded them carefully, a ritual that gave him time to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. The conspiracy wasn't just about money or environmental damage, it was about the weaponization of fear itself, the deliberate creation of conflict between groups that should have been working together to protect the land they all called home. "What about the surveillance photos?" he asked. "The monitoring of my activities?" "Legitimate concern from Webb's handlers," Morrison answered. "They knew that if their operation was discovered, you'd be the most likely person to piece together the truth. Your knowledge of the area, your relationship with the townspeople, your reputation for honesty, all of it made you a threat to their plan." The realization that his very integrity had made him a target was both flattering and disturbing. In trying to live quietly apart from society's complications, he'd inadvertently positioned himself as a guardian of values that powerful people found inconvenient. His mountain sanctuary hadn't protected him from the world's corruption. It had made him a more valuable witness to truth when corruption finally revealed itself. "So, what happens now?" Boone asked, looking around the room, at faces marked by exhaustion and the weight of revelations that changed everything they'd thought they understood about their quiet valley. The next 48 hours transformed Cedar Falls into the center of a federal investigation that reached from the quiet mountain valley to corporate boardrooms in Denver, Washington, and beyond. Media vans lined Main Street like modern-day covered wagons, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, while reporters sought interviews with anyone willing to discuss the conspiracy that had nearly turned their peaceful community into a crime scene. Boone found himself reluctantly thrust into the role of key witness, his mountain cabin serving as an unlikely command post for investigators who needed his expertise to document the environmental damage that had provided cover for Eagle Valley Copper's false flag operation. Agent Caldwell had established a temporary base of operations in his living room, her laptops and communication equipment transforming his simple frontier home into a high-tech nerve center. The contrast was jarring, federal agents with earpieces coordinating raids, while Flint dozed beside a wood-burning stove that Boone had built with his own hands. His carved walking stick leaned against the wall near sophisticated surveillance monitors that tracked the movements of mining company executives who might still pose a threat to witnesses. "We need you to guide our environmental team up to Eagle Creek," Caldwell explained, spreading topographical maps across his kitchen table. "Your observations about wildlife behavior and water contamination are crucial evidence, but we need to document everything with scientific precision before the mining company's lawyers start claiming the damage was pre-existing." Boone studied the proposed route, noting areas where the terrain would be challenging for investigators carrying heavy sampling equipment. "Better to approach from the North Ridge," he suggested, tracing an alternate path with his finger. "Longer hike, but easier footing for people who aren't used to mountain travel." Through his cabin windows, he could see federal agents establishing security perimeters in the forest, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. The sanctuary he'd built to escape civilization's complications was now protected by the very system he'd sought to avoid. The irony wasn't lost on him. His independence had made him valuable enough to merit government protection. Sheriff Morrison arrived that afternoon with news that added urgency to their preparations. "Got word from Denver," he announced, accepting the coffee that Boone offered. 3 more mining company executives were arrested this morning, but 2 others have disappeared. FBI thinks they might be heading this way to destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses. The possibility that corporate killers might be planning attacks on Cedar Falls residents felt surreal, like something from a movie rather than reality. But the evidence was mounting that Eagle Valley Copper's conspiracy went beyond simple fraud to include potential violence against anyone who threatened their operations. "We're evacuating non-essential personnel from town," Agent Caldwell added. "Families with children, elderly residents, anyone who doesn't need to be here for the investigation. Tom Bradley is coordinating with his garage as a staging area for people who need transportation." Boone thought about the townspeople he'd come to know better in recent days. Martha Henley, with her warm smile and fresh cookies. Vera May, still recovering from the trauma of nearly being blown up in her own diner. Young Sarah, who'd shown such courage in the aftermath of the bombing attempt. The idea that they might be in danger because of corporate corruption made his chest tighten with protective anger. "What about the diner?" he asked. "Earl and Vera May won't want to leave. We're setting up a safe zone around the main business district," Morrison explained. "Federal marshals will maintain security while we complete the investigation. Should only take another few days, but those might be the most dangerous few days this town has ever seen." As evening approached, Boone prepared for what might be his final night alone in the cabin that had been his refuge for 5 years. Tomorrow would bring a guided expedition into the high country to document environmental crimes that reached back years. After that, his testimony would be needed in federal court, his quiet life permanently entangled with legal proceedings that could take months or years to resolve. He sat on his porch as darkness fell, watching federal agents move through the forest with night vision equipment and tactical gear. Flint lay beside his chair, alert but calm, as if understanding that their simple life was ending and something more complex was beginning. The dog's acceptance of change was a lesson that Boone tried to take to heart, though his own feelings were more complicated. Agent Caldwell emerged from the cabin, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated with teams in Denver and Washington. When her call ended, she joined Boone on the porch, accepting his offer of coffee with the gratitude of someone who'd been running on adrenaline and determination for too long. "This is a lot for someone who just wanted to be left alone," she observed, settling into the wooden chair that Boone had carved during his first winter on the mountain. "Seems like being left alone isn't an option anymore," he replied, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "People like to think they can escape the world's problems by moving to places like this, but the problems have a way of following." "Are you angry," she asked, "about having your privacy invaded, your life disrupted?" Boone considered the question while sipping coffee that tasted of mountain water and careful brewing. "Angry about the deception," he said finally, "about innocent people being used as pawns in someone else's game, but not angry about getting involved. Sometimes a man has to choose between his comfort and what's right." Through the darkness, they could hear the sounds of federal agents establishing defensive positions around the cabin and throughout the valley. Radio chatter drifted through the pine trees, mixing with the natural sounds of night in the wilderness, owls calling, wind rustling through branches, the distant howl of coyotes claiming their territory. "Tomorrow's hike could be dangerous," Caldwell warned. "If Eagle Valley Copper executives are desperate enough to eliminate witnesses, they might try to stop us from reaching the contamination sites." Boone touched the handle of his carved walking stick, feeling the familiar texture of wood worn smooth by years of mountain travel. "I've been hiking these mountains for 20 years, he said quietly. "Know every trail, every shelter, every place to take cover if things go wrong. If they want to try something up there, they'll be fighting on my ground." The confidence in his voice surprised them both. Somewhere in the past week, the solitary mountain man who just wanted to be left alone had transformed into someone willing to stand up for the people and places he'd learned to care about. The change hadn't been dramatic or sudden, more like a gradual awakening to responsibilities he'd thought he'd successfully avoided. Flint raised his head as a helicopter passed overhead, its searchlight sweeping the valley in slow, methodical patterns. The dog's ears were pricked forward, alert but not alarmed. He seemed to understand that these mechanical intrusions were protecting rather than threatening their mountain home. "Get some rest," Agent Caldwell suggested, finishing her coffee and preparing to return to the communication equipment inside. "Tomorrow starts early, and we'll need to move fast once we reach the contamination sites." Boone remained on the porch after she went inside, listening to the night sounds and thinking about the journey that had brought him from simple breakfast at a small-town diner to the center of a federal investigation. Flint's instincts had saved lives and exposed corruption that reached far beyond their mountain valley. Now, it was up to him to help finish what his faithful companion had started, bringing truth to light and justice to people who'd thought they were above both. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns as old as the mountains themselves, indifferent to human schemes, but somehow comforting in their eternal reliability. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight was still his one last evening of peace before stepping fully into a world he'd spent 5 years trying to escape. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain peaks as Boone led a convoy of federal vehicles up the winding Forest Service road toward Eagle Creek. The trucks moved slowly through terrain that challenged their suspension and tested the resolve of city-trained investigators who weren't accustomed to wilderness travel. His own pickup, weathered and reliable, served as the lead vehicle, while Flint rode beside him with the alert posture of a dog returning to familiar hunting grounds. Agent Caldwell sat in the passenger seat of the truck behind him, coordinating with teams through her radio while studying the hand-drawn map that had become central to their investigation. 2 environmental specialists followed in a third vehicle, loaded with water sampling equipment and cameras designed to document contamination that could serve as evidence in federal court. The forest seemed different this morning, charged with tension that had nothing to do with the natural rhythms of wilderness life. Boone's experienced eye noted signs of recent human activity: tire tracks in muddy patches where no roads existed, broken branches at heights that suggested vehicles had passed through areas meant only for hiking. Someone else was in these mountains, and their presence felt wrong in ways that made his shoulder blades itch with warning. "Contact ahead," came the voice from his radio, Agent Martinez, the team leader riding in the second truck. Vehicle blocking the road, approximately 200 yards. Through his windshield, Boone could see a black SUV, parked sideways across the narrow track, positioned to prevent any vehicle from passing. 2 men in outdoor clothing stood beside it, their postures suggesting readiness for confrontation rather than casual conversation. One carried what appeared to be a hunting rifle, while the other held a radio that he spoke into with urgent gestures. "Corporate security," Agent Caldwell said grimly, studying the scene through binoculars. "Eagle Valley Copper must have sent them to prevent us from reaching the contamination sites." Boone stopped his truck 50 yards from the roadblock and stepped out slowly, his hands visible, but his movements conveying the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in this terrain. Flint jumped down from the passenger side, his amber eyes fixed on the strangers with the intense focus that had saved Cedar Falls from destruction. "This is private property," one of the men called out, his voice carrying across the mountain air with forced authority. "You need to turn around and leave immediately." Agent Caldwell emerged from the second truck with her badge clearly displayed and her own weapon visible but not drawn. "Federal agents conducting an environmental investigation," she announced. "You're interfering with a lawful operation." The standoff stretched taut as both sides evaluated their options. The corporate security team had chosen their position well. The narrow road offered no way around their vehicle, and the steep terrain on either side made bypass impossible for trucks carrying heavy equipment. But they hadn't counted on facing someone who knew these mountains better than the roads that crossed them. "There's another way," Boone said quietly to Agent Caldwell. "Game trail that parallels the road about half a mile north. Brings you out above Eagle Creek, but it's walking only." The environmental specialists would have to carry their equipment on foot, adding hours to their mission and exposing them to greater risk if corporate security decided to escalate beyond roadblocks. But the alternative was retreat, abandoning the investigation that had already cost so much effort and endangered so many lives. How long? Caldwell asked, her tactical mind already calculating risks and benefits. 2 hours to reach the creek, another hour to document what we need, Boone replied. But we'll be exposed on the ridgeline, visible from below if anyone's watching. Through his radio, he could hear the corporate security team calling for reinforcements, their calm facade beginning to crack under the pressure of a situation they hadn't been trained to handle. These were private contractors hired to intimidate rather than fight, but desperation could make anyone dangerous. We go on foot, Agent Caldwell decided. Martinez, stay with the vehicles. If we're not back in 4 hours, call for helicopter extraction. The decision transformed their mission from a routine evidence-gathering expedition into something that felt more like a military operation. Federal agents checked their equipment and adjusted their gear, while Boone shouldered his pack with the efficient movements of someone who'd made countless journeys into the high country. Flint seemed to understand that danger lay ahead. His ears were pricked forward, his nose testing the mountain air for scents that didn't belong. The dog's alertness was infectious, reminding everyone that they were entering territory where corporate interests had already demonstrated willingness to use violence. As they prepared to leave the road and strike out across country, Boone caught sight of movement in the tree line above the roadblock. Someone with binoculars was watching their preparations, reporting their movements to handlers who might be positioning additional obstacles between the investigation team and their destination. The game was escalating beyond simple intimidation. Eagle Valley Copper's remaining executives had apparently decided that preventing the environmental evidence from reaching federal court was worth risking assault charges against law enforcement officers. The stakes had risen to the point where corporate conspiracy was prepared to become corporate warfare. The game trail wound through aspen groves and granite outcroppings, climbing steadily toward the ridge that would give them access to Eagle Creek's upper reaches. Boone moved with the steady pace of someone who understood that mountain travel was about endurance rather than speed, while the federal agents behind him struggled with equipment that hadn't been designed for wilderness hiking. Flint ranged ahead of the group, his nose working constantly as he tested the air for signs of human presence. The dog's behavior had grown increasingly agitated as they climbed, his amber eyes scanning the forest with the intensity of a predator sensing danger from multiple directions. Movement on the left flank, Agent Caldwell whispered into her radio. Hers ears, voice barely audible above the sound of wind through pine branches. 200 yards, moving parallel to our route. Boone had seen them, 2 corporate security contractors, attempting to shadow their progress through terrain they didn't understand. Their movements were clumsy, broadcasting their position to anyone with woodland skills, but their presence meant the confrontation was escalating beyond simple roadblocks. The ridgeline opened before them like a window into the heart of the mountains, revealing Eagle Creek winding through the valley below. But the view also revealed the scope of environmental destruction that had driven Webb to desperate measures. Where pristine wilderness should have stretched toward distant peaks, mining operations had carved raw wounds into the landscape. Chemical-settling ponds reflected the morning sun like mirrors, their surfaces too bright and uniform to be natural water. Tailings piles rose like artificial mountains beside processing, facilities that belched steam into the clear mountain air. The contrast between untouched forest and industrial devastation was stark enough to make Agent Caldwell curse softly under her breath. "There," Boone said, pointing to a section of Eagle Creek that ran orange-brown instead of the crystal clear it should have been. "That's where the contamination starts. You can see the chemical discharge from here." Doctor Sarah Chen, the environmental specialist, began unpacking her water sampling equipment with the efficiency of someone who documented corporate crimes in dozens of locations. Her portable laboratory could provide preliminary analysis within minutes, generating the hard data needed to support federal charges against Eagle Valley Copper's executives. The sound of rotors echoed off the valley walls as a helicopter appeared over the eastern ridge, flying low and fast toward their position. For a moment, Boone hoped it might be federal reinforcements, but the aircraft's corporate markings and aggressive approach suggested otherwise. "Take cover," Agent Caldwell ordered, her weapon drawn as the helicopter circled their position like a mechanical vulture. The aircraft landed on the ridge 50 yards away, disgorging 4 men in tactical gear who moved with the precision of military contractors rather than corporate security guards. Their equipment was professional grade, their positioning tactical, their intent unmistakably hostile. "Federal agents," Caldwell called out, her badge visible as she took position behind a granite boulder. "You're interfering with an ongoing investigation." "Private property," the lead contractor replied, his voice amplified by the kind of confidence that came from superior firepower and corporate legal protection. "You're trespassing, and we're authorized to use necessary force to remove you." Boone found himself caught between two worlds, the peaceful wilderness he'd called home for 5 years and the violent confrontation that corporate greed had brought to his mountain sanctuary. But as he watched Dr. Chen continue her work despite the threat, collecting evidence that could protect Eagle Creek from further contamination, he realized that some things were worth fighting for. Flint had positioned himself between the dog and the contractors, his hackles raised and lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed every one of his sharp teeth. The dog's stance was protective rather than aggressive, but his amber eyes held the wild intensity of his coyote ancestry. "You've got 30 seconds to collect your equipment and leave," the contractor continued, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Doctor." Chen looked up from her sampling kit, her face pale but determined. "I need 10 more minutes to complete the documentation," she said quietly. The standoff stretched taut as mountain wind whistled through the pines and carried the sound of additional helicopters approaching from the south. But these aircraft bore federal markings, and their arrival shifted the tactical balance in ways that made the corporate contractors reassess their options. Agent Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. "FBI tactical team inbound. Maintain position and document everything." The corporate helicopter lifted off immediately, its crew apparently unwilling to face federal agents with arrest warrants and legal authority. The contractors on the ridge found themselves outnumbered and outgunned, their corporate authorization meaningless against federal law enforcement. As Dr. Chen completed her sampling and packed away evidence that would expose years of environmental crimes, Boone felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with a dog attacking a suitcase in a small-town diner was ending with justice, arriving by helicopter in the high country he called home. The mountains had revealed their secrets to those patient enough to listen, and now those secrets would speak in federal court, against corporate criminals who'd thought themselves above consequences. 6 months later, Boone Walker sat in his usual spot at the Dusty Lantern Diner, watching the morning sun paint Cedar Falls in shades of gold and promise. The town looked much the same as it had before. Webb's bombing attempt had shattered their peaceful existence, but subtle changes marked the transformation that crisis had brought to their mountain community. The diner's new security cameras were discreetly mounted, barely visible unless you knew where to look. A memorial plaque by the front door honored Flint's heroism in preventing tragedy, though the dog himself seemed more interested in the bacon that Earl was cooking on the grill than in his status as a local legend. Vera May poured coffee with her familiar smile, but her movements carried the confidence of someone who'd survived the unthinkable and emerged stronger. Sarah bustled between tables with renewed energy, her bright disposition undimmed by memories of federal agents and tactical helicopters. The resilience of small-town life had proven stronger than corporate conspiracies or environmental terrorism. Morning, Boone. Tom Bradley called from the counter, his mechanic's coveralls bearing the honest stains of productive work. Saw the news about the final sentences. Eagle Valley executives got 20 years each. The federal trials had concluded the previous week, delivering justice that felt both satisfying and inadequate. Corporate criminals would spend decades in prison for conspiracy, environmental crimes, and attempted terrorism, but the damage to Eagle Creek would take generations to repair. Still, the cleanup had begun, funded by asset seizures that had stripped the mining company of its profits and properties. Webb himself had received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, testifying against his corporate handlers with the fervor of a man who'd discovered how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. His environmental concerns had been real, his methods misguided, his exploitation by corporate interests complete. The wooden cross he'd worn during his arrest now hung in the sheriff's office, a reminder that good intentions could be weaponized by those without conscience. Sheriff Morrison entered the diner, his morning routine unchanged, despite the media attention that had briefly made Cedar Falls famous. "Coffee for the road, Vera May," he said, accepting the thermal cup that would fuel his patrol through valleys that felt safer now that their hidden dangers had been exposed. Through the window, Boone could see the bustle of a community that had learned to balance caution with trust, awareness with optimism. Martha Henley was arranging fresh produce outside her store while chatting with neighbors about everything except the federal investigation that had consumed their lives for months. The hardware store displayed a new selection of environmental monitoring equipment purchased with federal grants that would help residents track the creek's recovery. Agent Caldwell had visited the week before, driving up to his cabin in a government sedan that looked out of place among the pine trees and granite outcroppings. She'd brought news of the final convictions and an offer that surprised them both, a consulting position with the FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit, drawing on his wilderness expertise to investigate corporate malfeasance in remote locations. "Lot of companies think they can hide their crimes in places like this," she'd explained, gesturing toward the mountains that surrounded his clearing. "They underestimate people like you, folks who know the land well enough to spot changes that shouldn't be there." Boone had declined the offer, but the conversation had planted seeds of possibility that continued growing in unexpected directions. His testimony during the trials had revealed a gift for explaining complex environmental issues in terms that judges and juries could understand, translating scientific data into stories that resonated with human experience. Dr. Chen had contacted him about writing a book documenting the Eagle Creek investigation, combining his wilderness observations with her scientific analysis to create a guide for detecting environmental crimes. The project appealed to him more than federal employment, a chance to share knowledge without abandoning the mountain sanctuary that had shaped his perspective. The brass cash register at the diner counter had been restored to working order, its mechanical reliability a comforting constant in a world where electronic devices could be hacked or manipulated. Vera May's daily receipts reflected a steady increase in business as visitors came to see the place where a dog's instincts had prevented tragedy and exposed corporate corruption. Flint dozed beside Boone's chair, his amber eyes occasionally opening to survey the diner's familiar sights and sounds. The dog showed no awareness of his heroic status, content with belly rubs and bacon scraps while leaving human recognition to the humans who seemed to need it. His simple wisdom remained a lesson in living moment by moment without dwelling on past glories or future anxieties. As Boone finished his breakfast and prepared for the drive back to his cabin, he reflected on the journey that had transformed him from hermit to witness to something approaching community elder. The isolation he'd sought was gone, replaced by connections that felt more valuable than the solitude they'd displaced. Young families were moving to Cedar Falls, drawn by the story of residents who'd stood up to corporate power and won. The elementary school was expanding, the library adding computers funded by federal grants, the fire department training volunteers who understood that threats could come from unexpected directions. The mountains still called to him each morning, their peaks unchanged by human drama, their wildlife, recovering as Eagle Creek slowly ran clear again. But now his daily hikes included stops to check water quality monitors and chat with researchers documenting the restoration process. His sanctuary had become a classroom where the intersection of human ambition and natural law was studied and understood. Evening would find him on his porch with coffee steaming in the mountain air. Flint stretched beside his chair, both of them listening to sounds that spoke of healing rather than hiding. Sometimes the most extraordinary thing a man could do was simply bear witness to truth when others preferred comfortable lies. The mountains had taught him patience and observation. The crisis had taught him courage and connection. The combination felt like wisdom earned rather than wisdom inherited, rooted in experience that no amount of reading could provide. Sometimes, the most ordinary moments did become the most extraordinary memories.